So, within this, we've had to first talk about what the German war aims were. Within Europe, they had this idea of Mitteleuropa. And this is kind of what Pete Hitchens was basically talking about in terms of he basically tried to say that the EU is a kind of has been a setup similar to what this plan was. So the idea of the Mitteleuropa was that Germany, for its geopolitical position in Europe, being at the very heart of Europe, having a large population, having a very strong army, having a very strong economy, that Germany would naturally dominate the continent. It wouldn't have to occupy the whole of the continent as the Nazis tried to do, but they could basically set up independent, seemingly independent, like sovereign states. But these states would actually be beholden to Germany. They would be puppet states. They would be satellite states to the German Reich. Now we get a taste of this overall German war aim in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. So for those who don't know, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which was in 1918, it was basically a case in which the Germans had won the war on the Eastern Front. Now von Clausewitz famously once said that war is politics by different means. War is one way of achieving political aims, but if you can go for another way, then why not? Germany had obviously been fighting with Russia for 3 years, and the Russian military had been beaten in the field, had been pushed far, far back into its own territory because of the large incompetencies of the Russian military. However, they obviously were still fighting, and the amount of soldiers that they lost on the front didn't matter because Russia was like, no, we have to keep winning. We can't like pull out. We can't we can't let down our allies. So Germany hatched a cunning plan in which they basically got the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, to take over Russia. You had the February Revolution in February of 1917, in which the Tsar and his government was overthrown, and then what was installed was a provisional government, a democratic government. However, this provisional government was still focused on winning the war, well, at least trying to. However, Lenin's Bolsheviks, they wanted to get out of this so-called imperialist war, so these guys were communists, and they wanted Russia to leave this imperialist war and to basically focus on setting up communism. So Lenin was in exile in Switzerland, and so obviously for him to get back to Russia, he'd have to go through German territory. So the Germans set up what was known as the sealed train, and so this is where Lenin was put on a train and he was shipped up to the north of Germany and then set on a boat, and this boat went to Finland, and then through Finland went into St. Petersburg. And then from St. Petersburg, this is where he launched his October Revolution, or as some have called the October Coup. Him and his Bolsheviks basically did like an armed coup. They took over the main things of government within St. Petersburg, and from there they were able to take over the Russian state. And once they took control of Russia, then they end up taking Russia out of the war. However, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was a very harsh treaty in which the Germans basically imposed their will on the Bolsheviks, because the Bolsheviks just wanted peace at any price. Yeah, this has been one of their main aims. It was peace, land and bread, and yeah, they needed that peace part. And that's because part of the reason why the provisional government was so unpopular was because they had continued this war. And so when the Germans said, right, this is our war aims, this is what we want from you, they had no choice but to submit. And so we can see on the map here what ended up being taken from Russia as part of the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. And obviously you can see quite a lot of the territory of Russia being taken off and being created into independent satellite states under the German yoke. This region here represents 25% of the Russian Empire's population and about 90% of its coal deposits, which means that Russia, which was a very strong country at the time, Germany was very worried that it would soon overtake it. By, I believe, 1930, it was predicted that the Russian economy would overtake the German economy. So Germany thought, we're going to need to take them out quickly. And actually there are some estimates that say it could have happened as early as 1916, although those sources are kind of dispute. So by taking Russia out of the war and by taking its most valuable territory, it basically would have crippled Russia and made it so that they would never be a threat. You basically neutralise the threat from the east. And then in the west, what they planned to do was basically to take the industrial northeastern part of France and then all of the kind of channel ports like Boulogne and Calais, and also to swallow up big chunks of Belgium within the German Reich. Within the whole of Europe, the idea was that even countries like France would have to join this Mitteleuropa, this idea of Germany being at the very centre of Europe and all the other countries being client states to it. Add to this the aims that the German colonial empire had, which was to basically set up Mittelafrika. Within the continent of Africa, Germany had 4 colonies, and as you can see on the map, you have Tanganyika, which is modern-day Tanzania, you have Namibia in the south, and you have Cameroon in the west. So the idea of the Germans was basically to link all these territories together. So if Germany had taken on this territory, they would have had a lot of resources, they would have had access to rubber, access to all sorts of minerals, and all sorts of metals. By doing this, Germany would have expanded its colonial empire, it would have basically taken control over most of Europe, it would have been the unquestioned dominant power in Europe and arguably in the world at that time. Add on top of that, the reparations, which we spoke about with Versailles and how they were very harsh. Yes, the Germans also wanted the French to pay reparations for this war, which would have amounted to 10 billion marks. So just to give an idea of this 10 billion marks would have paid for all of the veterans of that war, all the German veterans of that war, and then also paid off Germany's entire national debt. So that's a huge amount of money in the grand scheme of things, yeah? So Germany would have been debt-free, and it would have been paid for all by the defeated French. And all of this came as part of the plan known as the September Programme, which was obviously set up in September of 1914. So this is when the German High Command came together and said, this is our war aims, this is what we want the map of Europe and the world to look like. And so now that we've covered the German war aims, we have to look at the effects of the war on Britain. So Britain spent a lot of money on this war, it bankrupted itself, it went from being the world's largest creditor to the world's largest debtor. So just to give an idea of this, by the war's end, 40% of government spending in Britain was devoted purely to paying off the interest on the debt from this war. And actually, the debt itself was not paid off until 2015. Yes, you heard that right, 2015. So the war ended in 1918. It took the British government until 2015 to pay off the war. So that gives you an idea of just how indebted they were. Add on top of that the shocks that end up happening as a result of this. So Britain, which had always been renowned for being, for having a very stable currency in the pound, its inflation doubled between the years of 1914 to 1920, and the value of the pound actually fell by 61%. So this, in terms of consumer spending, it contracted by 61% throughout the course of the war. So Britain was dead broke by the end of this. Yes, it ended up winning. Yes, it played a decisive role in this war, but it came out of it as a very much weaker country. So if Germany hadn't invaded Belgium and had simply taken out France as they had in the War of 1870, then there's almost no chance that the British would have joined that war. Now, World War One is etched into the consciousness of every British person, you know. So every year on the 11th of November, we remember and honour our war dead from that war with a 2-minute silence. It's had a huge impact on us, yeah. Because of the amount of troops who died in that war, it numbered about 900,000. This is much more than we end up losing as World War II as a country. So in that regard, we wouldn't have been as affected, it wouldn't have changed us psychologically as a nation, in having that lost generation, as it was called, of men who never lived and never survived the war. But why did Britain even consider joining the Allies in the first place? Prior to World War One, Germany had overtaken Britain as the dominant power in Europe. So this is Germany just with 5 colonies compared to Britain, which at the time had the world's largest empire, and actually the largest empire the world had ever seen, with colonies such as India, etc., which we've covered in our previous videos covering the British Empire and the empire in India specifically. So Britain felt that they were being overtaken by their rival. And it didn't help that the Kaiser, who was actually the grandson of Queen Victoria, was also very hostile to Britain and wanted to outcompete them in the imperial game and also in the naval game, which obviously Britain being an island, it could never accept. From 1906, with the first dreadnought being built, the Germans were like, "Oh, I want one as well, I want one as well." Kaiser Wilhelm wanted to overtake Britain in the production of having the largest navy and in having the most number of dreadnoughts. And this is what has started what's known as the naval arms race between Britain and Germany. Now, many people say that the naval arms race directly led to World War One. it was a contributing factor, but it alone wasn't the reason why Britain ended up going to war. It hardened relationships between Britain and Germany and made Britain more hostile towards Germany and more seeing it as an enemy and as a rival. But it didn't directly lead to World War One. And the reason for this is because the naval arms race was actually over many, many years beforehand. So Britain builds the first dreadnoughts in 1906. Then, year by year, the Germans start to build some more, and the British public panic and go, no, we can't have the Germans, we can't have the Germans out competing us. So we go, right, we're going to build even more ships. And yeah, it gets to the point where the Germans can't keep up. I think there was only 2 years, I believe in 1908 and 1909, where German production either matched or surpassed the British. And we'll read out some of the stats now. So the British in 1914 had 29 dreadnoughts, they had 209,000 personnel, and they had 2.2 million tonnage of ships. The Germans, by comparison, had 17 dreadnoughts, they had 79,000 personnel, and they had 1 million tonnage of ships. So you can see that, the gap is pretty big between Britain and Germany. However, obviously, a massive concern for the British is that at the time, 58% of their caloric intake came from imports from abroad. So that means that 58% of all the calories that were consumed in Britain came from abroad. And so Britain being an island, if you cut off our trade routes with the rest of the world, then you could starve the British out. And so the Germans realised, we don't have to spend this huge amount of money on these big battleships. We can basically set up U-boats, which are basically submarines, and we can sink the British naval merchant fleet and basically starve Britain out. And so this was a big concern for Britain going into the war.